The Athletic.
Hello and welcome along to Aramco F1 Focus, the podcast that aims to get you thinking about Grand Prix racing that little bit differently. This is episode 4 of our podcast, so if you've missed them previously, make sure to go back and check out our other episodes. And just as in the previous 3, I, Tim Silvey, am joined by my 2 right-hand men, F1 Stat Supremo Sean Virtual Statman Kelly and Norfolk racing royalty Alex Brundle. Sean, how's it going? Since we last spoke, we've had no race in Imola, but a belter in Monaco. Are you ready to dazzle us with some stats ahead of the Spanish Grand Prix this weekend?
Well, I mean, the thing is, there are many other instances of races that should have happened, could have happened, might nearly have happened, but never happened.
And Alex, how are things in your world?
Things are great in my world. I'm either in a race car or I'm shouting at one over a microphone. So I'm very much enjoying life on both behind the mic and behind the wheel.
So, what are we waiting for? Let's get going with focus number 1. So here we are then, focus number 1, which this week is Sean's stat focus. Sean, we did get a race in Monaco, but we didn't get one in Imola. And I gather it's actually the race that never happened that you want to talk about, because there are several interesting examples in history where forces of nature have played havoc with the schedule.
Yes, I mean, increasingly so in the 21st century, as sanity has begun to prevail, and we've started to realise that driving Formula One cars when they can't actually cut through the water on the racetrack and are aquaplaning down the straight, or they simply can't see their hand in front of their face when they're doing 200 miles an hour, is probably a bad idea, and certainly is not racing. I mean, drivers had been saying that for many a long year, and finally those of us, the powers that be, if you will, on the sidelines acquiesced to that. There were certain instances in the recent past where other acts of God, not just flooding, came to reshape a race weekend. We think in particular of the Japanese Grand Prix. The 2004 Japanese Grand Prix, there was a typhoon, Ma-on, that hit the racetrack on the Saturday, and F1 and the FIA had the advanced sanity to tell everybody to not even attempt to come to the track on Saturday. It was completely washed out. There was never any hope of anything taking place on the track that day. And they rescheduled the qualifying session to Sunday morning, which is the first time they'd ever done that. But we have seen qualifying on Sunday morning several other times. Japan again in 2010, Australia 2013, USA in 2015. That really was a washout on the Saturday. And again, an exact rerun of the circumstances of 2004 happened in 2019 at Suzuka as well. Another typhoon, Hagibis, hit the track. Everybody was told, don't go to the track on Saturday. There's famously photographs of a lot of the drivers crowded around the PlayStation with Max Verstappen playing FIFA on the Saturday while they waited for everything to pass through. And they ran qualifying on a Sunday morning. So it is useful as a sort of force majeure, but less so as a permanent addition.
But were there occurrences around certain races being stopped and not being restarted?
There were several instances of that. And again, Canada 71 is sort of the first instance, but there were many examples thereafter, and a lot of them, for the same reason, are sort of forgotten by history because they red flag the race and then they don't restart it. So in people's minds, it never actually, it ran to a checkered flag and they didn't think of anything else. I think in particular of Brazil 1974, which was red flagged due to rain and not restarted. Belgium 1981 was red flagged and not restarted because of weather. There are some more egregious examples, races that we usually bit dicey. Austria 75 was wet all the way through and it just got wetter still and they red flagged it, and Vittorio Brambilla crashed across the finish line because he was so surprised to see the checkered flag and the red flag at the same time that he realized, I've won the race, I've also crashed the car. And then Silverstone 75, a very famous one, when it looked like it was threatening rain, and then finally it dumped on the racetrack and almost everybody went off at Club Corner. I think there's only 2 cars left on the track by the time they put the red flag out. Everybody else was off in the railway sleepers, as they were, back at Club Corner at Silverstone, with Emerson Fittipaldi winning. That was Emerson Fittipaldi's last ever Grand Prix win, incidentally. There was also instances where races were red flagged, because of the rain, and they said, let's not restart it. Another famous example, of course, Australia 1991. That was a race that was red flagged after 14 laps. They sort of hung around for a bit, thought, no, not going to get any better. And they waved the checkered flag and said, that's all, folks, 14 laps is your lot. The irony of that being that later in the day, it cleared up and they probably could have run a dry race.
But that wasn't the shortest race ever. There have been shorter ones, and it would be amiss of us not to talk about Spa 2021. Surely, Sean, that goes down as one of the shortest races of all time. And for those that might not remember, can you just tell us what happened?
Well, it is the shortest race. For the longest time, Australia 1991, with its 14 laps, was the shortest. And then we have a new king of the throne, Spa 2021, the exercise in futility that afternoon was. And they did try very hard to try and get the race on because, I mean, obviously everyone's there. You want the race to happen and you try and make it happen. But they waited on it and waited on it. It wasn't getting any better. Eventually they ran the safety car for one lap, put the red flag back out, and they never restarted it. In fact, I think they put it out. I think the race safety car might have run officially for 2 laps. They then put the red flag out. They don't restart the race. So that the 1 lap is the official distance. Now that therefore gives us some really quirky things in the history books, because it means that Max Verstappen is the only person in Grand Prix history to lead every lap of a Grand Prix, but also only the last lap of a Grand Prix. They're both the same race because there was only 1 lap. So he led it start to finish by only leading the last lap. There are also officially no retirements in that race. There were officially no pit stops in the race, although people did come into the pits. Officially there weren't any pit stops. And then you had the oddity of Nikita Mazepin setting the fastest lap behind the safety car because he was at the back and basically had the largest run-up in terms of being able to, give it a bit of welly, set the fastest lap as per timing and scoring, but it was then annulled because they said, basically, this is nonsense. How can you have the fastest lap when it's 3 minutes and 27 seconds? Sorry, we're not counting that. So even that went out as well. So there's some really, really odd things that happened at that Spa 2021 race. And I'm sure anybody who spent an absolute fortune getting out into the middle of the Ardennes forest to watch that debacle will be enthused by the fact that they can be constantly reminded of it anytime they go to the record books.
I think that's one of my favourite F1 oddities, that race. An absolutely bizarre set of circumstances. But a classic racetrack where it's that racetrack where commentators always say that dreaded line of it's raining in one part of the track and not the other. I remember being at Spa one year when they were looking at the radar and umming and ahhing about whether to go out or not. And I just thought, all this technology is great, but you could just put your arm out the front of the pit lane and just see if it's raining. All these people staring at screens, all you have to do is turn behind you and put your arm out and you can feel it for yourself. But Sean, there were a number of races where they were affected for other conditions, not just weather related or rain or hurricanes or typhoons. Give us some of the occasions where weather wasn't the reason for races being postponed or cancelled.
I think a lot of F1 fans, when they look, if they were ever shown the full ledger of races that were on the calendar at some point and then were cancelled, never took place, having been announced, would be shocked at just how many races there are. And there are some very obscure ones. For instance, the Moroccan Grand Prix of 1958, that's the only time Formula One has ever raced in Morocco as a championship event. It was on the calendar in subsequent years, but never happened. There were other races like Australia. There was supposed to be an Australian World Championship Grand Prix in 1970 at Warwick Farm. That didn't happen. There was supposed to be a Soviet Union Grand Prix. That never happened. So there are many examples of things not taking place, but there are more unusual circumstances than just money and politics. For instance, after the Le Mans disaster of 1955, 4 of the remaining championship events were cancelled in 1955. And that meant that Juan Manuel Fangio, when he finished second to Stirling Moss at Aintree in 55, that famous side-by-side finish of the Mercedes W196, Stirling Moss winning the race at Aintree, Fangio second. Well, Fangio, by that result, had inadvertently become the world champion, but he didn't know on the day because the races weren't officially cancelled until after the fact. So if you retroactively, that was the moment he became champion, because from that point on, there was no way he could have been caught in the remaining races. One of the most intriguing examples of race cancellations came in 1956 and 57, when the Suez Crisis was in full swing. For those of you who are of a younger disposition, and bearing in mind we're talking about the mid-50s, that means anybody under the age of about 70, the Suez Crisis, too long didn't read, big political crisis between the UK, Egypt, Israel. There was a war. The Suez Canal was closed. They couldn't get oil through, this sort of stuff. That meant that 2 races were cancelled in 1956 and 3 races were cancelled in 1957 because of basically not wanting to use the oil that they could get available at that time. There are another couple of examples where the passing of a favourite driver led to the cancellation of an otherwise popular event. Mexico 1971 didn't take place after the death of Pedro Rodriguez. He died in July of that year. After the death of Ronnie Peterson and then Gunnar Nilsson, there was no Swedish Grand Prix in 1979. And in fact, there's never been a Swedish Grand Prix ever since. And it's amazing. I always cite Sweden as a great example of a country that went from being top of the world to just obscurity almost overnight, because they had a race-winning driver in Ronnie Peterson in 78. They had Gunnar Nilsson, who was undergoing treatment for cancer. He'd already won a Grand Prix in 77. Both were gone, and then very quick thereafter, there was no race in Sweden, and we never ever went back as a sport. There were other more exciting ones, like the European Grand Prix at Brands Hatch 1983. That was supposed to be a Grand Prix around Flushing Meadows, which is now the site of the US Open tennis tournament, formerly Expo 62. There was supposed to be a Grand Prix of Flushing Meadows in New York. That never happened. Just like every other race that Formula One has tried to do in New York has never happened, and we're still waiting. Of course, there was supposed to be one in 2013, I think it was. We've still never raced in New York as a sport. Formula E beat Formula One to the punch in that regard. And then a really weird one, Canada 1987. I give you this one. This was a dispute between the 2 big brewers in Canada, Labatt and Molson, and they had a set 2, a rumble, a contretemps, if you will, about who had sponsorship rights for what. And it ended up with such a barney that there ended up being no race at all in Canada in 1987. So that was a very unusual cancellation indeed, because you basically got two companies arguing over who's paying for it. No, we're paying for it. No, we're paying for it. No, we want to pay for it. Normally it's the other way around. You pay for it. This was a race that was cancelled because both of them wanted to pay for it.
Okay, Sean, but what about postponements rather than cancellations? What examples have we got there?
Well, the one everyone always cites is Spa 1985. And what a story we had there. You mentioned earlier how Spa can be raining at one end, not at the other. You know, stick your hand under out of the garage. Is it raining? Is it not raining? This sort of stuff. Well, in 1985, the organisers decided they would resurface the racetrack with this then, cutting edge material that would reduce. I think it was either to improve grip in the wet or to reduce spray, or maybe it was both. But they did this, but it got delayed because of the weather. Ironically, it was a bad winter in Belgium. I mean, it's a bad winter at Spa most winters, but it was obviously an unduly bad winter. And they only got this surface finished 2 weeks before the race. Now, I'm not an expert in construction, but I am told that you need to give it a little bit of time once you've actually surfaced it to let it all settle and be ready for racing. Well, they all went out. All the team showed up. They all went out on Friday. They did the Friday running. And remember, this is the mid-1980s when the cars are 1.5 litre turbocharged behemoths. They've all got 1,000+ horsepower at their fingertips in qualifying. The turbo cars started to churn up the track, literally. The rear wheels of these cars was with qualifying tires, remember, so the extra grip from those as well, was literally churning up the racetrack. So it was starting to look like, like a sandy beach of tarmac. So by the end of that day, they'd broken the track, effectively. Well, Bernie got them all gathered around, and Jean-Marie Balestre and all that stuff, and there was all a big hullabaloo, and they decided they can't race. So they postponed the F1 race, but tried to get all the other races out the way, which are less damaging to the track. And they had to reschedule the Belgian Grand Prix for September. I think it was supposed to be in June of that year, or May, I can't remember. So they came back in September, and that led to this very odd situation with the entry list for that race, because at the previous Grand Prix at Monza, Alan Jones and the Beatrice Haas Lola, not the current Haas, but the first Haas that we had in Formula One, had showed up, made their Grand Prix debut back in the mid-80s when teams would show up mid-season to make their debut. They then were not allowed to enter the Belgian Grand Prix. Why? Because the Belgian Grand Prix originally was supposed to take place back in June or whenever it was, and they weren't on the entry list. So they'd made their debut, and then they were told, sorry mate, you can't race. You can't come to this race because this race was supposed to be happening months ago and you weren't here. So you're out. So that was a strange situation on its own. So that sometimes postponements can create some oddities. The only other, well, I say sometimes, we've only had really two bona fide postponements. The other one was in 1995 at the Pacific Grand Prix in Aida. In 94 and 95, there was two races in Japan. There was Suzuka and Aida. Putting aside the fact that Aida was considered too small and too slow, even for Japanese Formula Nippon, but they could run a Formula One race. Fine, okay. In 94, Michael Schumacher had won. In 95, it was supposed to run as an early season race because, of course, Suzuka was at the end of the season. There was then the Great Hanshin earthquake, which was centered around Kobe, which was the region of Japan where the racetrack was. Couldn't run the race. Much the same, it brings us back to the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix, in fact, because it was a case of, look, the racetrack itself could run the race, but we need the emergency authorities and we need to divert the resources to the people who need it most. We mustn't run this race. So they postponed it and ran it as a double header back to back with the Japanese Grand Prix. So we had two races in Japan on consecutive weekends. Even stranger was the next two races were both in Australia. It was the last round of 95, the first race in 96. So we had four consecutive races in two countries. Michael Schumacher won that Pacific Grand Prix in 1995, and that was actually the race in which he won his second world championship. So Formula One never went back there, but there was certainly quite a story, both sporting and otherwise, about that 1995 Pacific Grand Prix.
Wow. Love that. Love that. Thank you, Sean, for proving that you don't need to have a race to actually have taken place to drop some gargantuan stat bombs on us. And remember, everyone, if you want to comment on anything Sean, Alex, or myself have to say, drop us a line on social media using hashtag AramcoF1Focus. Right, now it's time for Alex to separate the understeer from the oversteer in his performance focus. So, Alex, something a bit different from you this week. Tell us what you've got for us.
Well, we've been so specific to the races which have been occurring, but I'd like to dive a little bit into the psychology of a winning Formula One driver. And something really jumped out at me, Tim, and I believe you've got the quote for us, something which Max Verstappen said just a few weeks back, which I think gives us a real insight into his psychology and some of the pressures, perhaps the unseen pressures that drivers are under.
I do indeed. So, and I quote, "I do like racing. I do like winning. I know that, of course, there is a salary and everything and you have a good life, but is it actually a good life? Sometimes you get to a point in your career where maybe you want to do other stuff." A fairly loaded statement there from Max. Alex, what was it about this quote that really stood out for you?
I think it's an interesting one because we carry this, the Formula One is the dream, isn't it? For so many young drivers, young people who, it's one of those astronaut careers. I would like to be, an astronaut, a doctor, a pop star, a Formula One driver. And we sort of blanket assume that it comes with this incredible lifestyle. It comes with this incredible opportunity to drive these fabulous cars all over the world. There's this perception that drivers cannot be having a difficult time. There is no possible way they can be having a difficult time. And I wanted to try to explain why that quotation, from where that feeling emanates.
Yeah, and there is this perception in the public of, oh, you poor little racing driver, life's so hard for you and your private jet and everything else. Should fans like us be taking a softer stance on Formula One racing drivers? And is it those sorts of pressures from the public that actually does make it hard for them?
I think there are two factors to this, or two positions. Firstly, there's the route that those drivers have taken coming up through the ranks. A driver like Max Verstappen has been, since he was a very, very young man, week by week by week, accountable for his performance, has had his life presented to him on a piece of paper and the prospects for his life presented to him on a piece of paper weekend by weekend, which changes your psychology. Formula One drivers these days have never had more public scrutiny. We're dealing with one of the biggest audiences that have ever watched Formula One. They also have never had greater access granted to them from the public through things like social media, through activities to bring fans closer to the sport, which I think is a fantastic thing. I think we do have to be mindful of that in the way that we treat them, in the stances that we make, and the teams really do have to protect them. It's hard as a public to put ourselves in the position of those drivers being treated basically like, objects, given Verstappen, Hamilton did this, Verstappen did that. They're basically treated like objects named by their second name. And it does, I believe, have a psychological effect on those drivers, especially those drivers like Max Verstappen, starting out in Formula One when he's 17 years old. You've got to wonder if that will eventually burn him out as a sportsman.
Do you think that's likely to happen? I mean, should we be worried about quotes like this? He's saying sometimes you get to a point in your career, maybe you want to do other stuff. Do you think this is the first signs of him feeling that burnout and thinking, well, there is life after motorsport. What am I going to do next? Is he on the way out?
Yeah, I mean, to keep that pinnacle of performance, there's always this assumption that, because we see it so much, and I think we as broadcasters have a great responsibility here to try to explain the challenge of jumping into a Formula One car. And there's often the temptation to be macho, to be bravado about how difficult it is to just jump in a Formula One car and perform. And that leads to a certain sort of flippance about how hard it is to be on that edge of performance all the time, how much mental energy it takes, how much psychological strife it takes for these drivers to actually achieve this. And I believe that perception that anybody can just jump in these race cars and do this job from the public, having it left to them in such a way leads to perhaps a difficult relationship with these often young sports people that can potentially lead to that little bit of burnout that we're discussing.
Alex, one of the things that occurs to me from the outside is that you spend a tremendous amount of time not driving. Almost 99% of your job is not actually the driving part. That's just the little 1% on the end. And I've met other drivers down the years who fell out of racing because they spent so much time finding money and dealing with trying to get budgets together. The driving almost, dare I say it, no pun intended, took a back seat to everything else. What's your experience of that?
Well, it happens more and more. I have the great pleasure of commentary and broadcast on Formula 2 and Formula 3, looking into some of the costs involved, looking into some of the difficulty even to get, bums in seats of those cars, and how much is involved. I mean, as a driver, throughout multiple years of my career, the moment I have stepped out of the car in the final race of the year is the moment I've started with my PowerPoint presentations, PDF documents, meetings, discussions, contracts, and so on and so forth. There's no union to protect racing drivers. There's nobody's responsible for if these contracts, these deals actually happen, absolutely everything falls to the feet of these young people, their families, and maybe if they deem it necessary to pay one and find one who is of the correct stance and of the correct integrity, their managers. So by the time you've arrived at Formula One, as a young racing driver, you've seen probably 10, if you've done one year on year at a minimum, you've seen probably 10 heavyweight contracts with 6 or 7 figure numbers in them, and signed on the dotted line and taken that risk and taken that responsibility. And I do think it's a really big deal. Even before these drivers make Formula One, the psychological predisposition to risk is massively skewed on what normal young people and normal people in general deal with.
Yeah, and you've got to be a businessman and a racing driver, haven't you? You talk about, even before you get to Formula One there's, even at karting levels, you can spend £100,000 a year in karting alone, let alone getting up sort of F3, F2 levels. And there's a driver I used to manage in Formula One years ago, sort of 2012, 2013, and he wouldn't mind me saying that at the time he had to pay £11 million for a back of the grid seat, where he literally poodled around at the back of the grid. And that was not uncommon. And that's a small figure compared to some of the figures that have happened in more recent history. So it's incredibly difficult challenge for them. Why do you think there is this perception, though, that Joe Bloggs could just hop in a car and go 2/10 off Lewis Hamilton with the right equipment?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because, the analogy I always draw is, put me in the ring with even my weight. I'd probably be featherweight, I would have thought. Boxing.
Don't do yourself an injustice. You'd be at least a middleweight.
I think they might do me an injustice very, very quickly. But put yourself in the ring with a boxing champion, even at sort of a domestic level, or if you went down the high street and asked everyone in your local high street, how do you think you'd get on as centre forward for England? They'd go, yeah, I couldn't even, I wouldn't last 5 minutes. But then there's this weird thing in motorsport. If you walk down the high street, how close do you think you could get to Lewis Hamilton? And you get this sense that people would say, well, for a couple of seconds, after a few laps. The right answer is, do you think you could get Lewis Hamilton's car out of the pit lane, and how many attempts do you think it would take you? And I do think that we do the sport a disservice as journalists, honestly, in not explaining how difficult that is. And I do think that we are, for example, in explaining the costs, in explaining the, some of the financial difficulties, we do give the implication that you pays your money, you takes your choice, towards the midfield and the back of Formula 2, Formula 3 and Formula 1. What needs expressing, I believe, and what would lead to, I think, a greater feeling of sort of reverence and a greater enjoyment of the sport from everyone is a recognition that even though you've got to find your money, it's quite hard to be on the pace as well. It's a sport that you have to give your entire existence to and find the money in order to achieve. And that's a tough thing to communicate. But, looking specifically at Max Verstappen, though, his funding all the way through has been Red Bull related. That pressure is something which is not to be underestimated. And that pressure from such a young age. I think his only comparison really in that way is Lewis Hamilton, who had a very similar path from McLaren, moving on through his junior career. And you do wonder if that, while you're forming psychologically, while you're discovering yourself as a person, having that weekend on weekend pressure, how much that changes you and how much you're actually going to be able to adapt then to normal life after you've finished in Formula One.
You mentioned some of the pressures there that drivers face, and there are numerous pressures that Formula One drivers have to put up with, whether it be pressure from journalists and media, social media opinion, the Twitter mobocracy, teammate pressures, and you look at the likes of, Verstappen and Perez at the moment, team bosses pressures, the likes of, the Red Bull driver program, which has its own pressures that come with it, the pressure of making it to Formula One, and then having to perform. And you look at the likes of Nick de Vries at the moment. What are some of those pressures in a little more detail, Alex, and how much do they affect people? And do they even touch the sides of people like Verstappen? He seems so level-headed and cool. Do these pressures get to him?
Well, of course, we can complain a lot about being it being tough, but we're also our own worst enemy in the motorsport paddock, because of course the first thing you do when you're in a single seater team and you're not working with your teammate, as we do in the sport, well, you are working with them, but that's also the first person you need to beat. The first thing we'll try to do is probe for weakness, and those are the things that you're looking to do, and that personality clash, that meeting of the minds between two teammates and who has the stronger psychology. Like, for example, when you take Verstappen and all of the teammates he's had, and then you look at the character of Sergio Perez and how he's been able to deal with that, probably better than any other teammate is. It's very indicative, I think, of the kind of character you need to be in order to deal with that psychological pressure. Drivers in that environment who are able to deal with that are very much of a type. They tend to be quite matter of fact, quite assertive, quite dead to other people's opinion, which I think is something you can see in the way that Max Verstappen goes about his motorsport, in the way that Max Verstappen answers questions and deals with the media. They're often accused of being quite arrogant or ignorant to other people's opinion, but actually I think as soon as you open that door, as a professional race car driver, there are so many opinions available in the world of Formula One that it'd be like putting a dent in the Hoover Dam. The so much opinion and assertion would come flooding through that actually I think those drivers have realised you can't even nudge the gate open, otherwise the sheep will come flooding through. So those kind of characters tend to be completely averse to the media type of character, which are quite forthcoming and quite sort of information sharing. They tend to be quite closed off and focused, which is always a very interesting thing when you prop a microphone under a driver's nose.
I'm curious to get your personal opinion on this, where you look at someone like Max Verstappen, like I said, very cool head, probably can deal with a lot of things by himself. There are other drivers, and I was lucky enough to talk to Romain Grosjean the other day, who has for a number of years had a mind performance coach. Do you think, from your perspective, that those kind of tools like mind performance coach is that a valuable resource to help deal with some of these pressures?
Oh, definitely. I mean, from very early in my career, I undertook concentration training, would be completely lost without it, to try and focus in and block out everything else. And especially if you are one of those drivers like Romain Grosjean, who's more of a forthcoming character, it can be really tough to take that sort of cold, calculated approach. I mean, I won't name any names, but there are two drivers I've spoken to very closely. One who's my teammate in another guise, and one I know very well from a friendship perspective, who simply will openly say that they psychologically couldn't cope with Formula One, and that was what held them back. In a Formula One car, they were absolutely capable of dealing with. They were absolutely capable of dealing with the car. They were absolutely capable of driving the laps. Testing went brilliantly. The performance and the engineering side went brilliantly, but the pure psychological pressure from a focus perspective was not available to them because they simply weren't the right character. And I do think you see those drivers, for example, like Romain Grosjean has done, go away and perform in other series. a little bit like, you've drawn the example of Nick de Vries there, who has performed in multiple other series where the scrutiny is not quite as great. And that's why, and then comes into Formula One and has a little bit more of a difficult time. And that's why it's such a roll of the dice the first time you jump in an F1 car, because it's its own thing, isn't it? We're not doing a podcast about Formula E this week. We're not doing a podcast about WEC this week. We're doing a podcast about Formula One because the masses are interested in Formula One, which changes the way that the race tracks, the race teams, and the race events operate.
I want to ask you a little bit more about dragging it back to Verstappen and Red Bull. So Red Bull have had this sort of notorious reputation for sink or swim, and they bring drivers through their program. And if you're a Max Verstappen, everything's hunky-dory. You're going to do great, and keep winning, fantastic. If you come in though and you're up against Max Verstappen and you've got a role to play and you don't fulfill that role, you can very quickly find yourself in a bit of bother. Is that a good thing for driver development? Is that sort of sink or swim mentality a positive?
The proof is in the pudding, I think, for them. They have found Max. They found Max by hook or by crook. They call it a crucible. It is a massively pressurizing scenario. The question, though, I would ask is more from a marketing perspective as much, or a PR perspective as much as anything, and it interests me that the audience themselves don't make more noise about the ones that fall away, about the ones that fall behind, about the drivers who have given their absolute life to that program, signed everything away, and then are unceremoniously ditched. We, as a race car driver and as a broadcaster in the feeder series, I see them fall by the wayside, and I see a little bit more of the collateral damage. And I do wonder if, from a more of a human and a PR perspective, that's the right thing to do. From a racing perspective, you can't argue with results.
Well, I think despite what Max has said in that quote that we mentioned at the beginning of this segment about doing other stuff, I think it's fair to say that he'll be around for a few more years to come and continue to win many, many more championships. Alex, let's leave it there for now. Thank you as ever. Very thought-provoking performance focus from you. I know I'll be watching the Verstappen-Perez title battle with fresh eyes going forwards. Well, that's about it for today. This podcast is brought to you by Aramco, powered by How, and we'll be back with you again soon. In the meantime, be sure to like, follow, or subscribe to the Race F1 Tech Show podcast feed to ensure you never miss an episode of that podcast or this one. Alex, more racing on the cards in the next few weeks?
Oh, I love the Nürburgring 24 hours, but I need a bit of a rest now. So I'm going to have one, and then I'll be back in the F2 and F3 combox for Silverstone.
Sounds great. And Sean, off to Spain, I presume?
Yes, sir. Got everything in the suitcase. Got to get the bus to Barcelona from here in Monaco, if anybody knows where I can take it from.
Terrific stuff. Thank you both, as ever, for joining me. Until next time, it's goodbye from Sean.
Bye.
Goodbye from Alex.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from me. Goodbye.
The Athletic.